Once again, good evening to Early Worcester Baseball, a conversation with some of Worcester's favorite baseball historians. Worcester's baseball connections are well known, and you will certainly hear more about those tonight. From the longest game ever played to the perfect game and lots more, Worcester has stepped up to the bat more than once. Worcester Historical Museum is only 1 year older than the National League, and we precede baseball's arrival in Worcester by 3 years and the Major League Baseball by 5 years. Through those years, we have continued to collect the stories and artifacts for the game known as Worcester's pastime. And with the arrival of the Woo Sox and the continuing draw of the Bravehearts, we will continue to do so in the future. So grab a hot dog, some Cracker Jacks if you like, and maybe a drink, and let's hear some more about Worcester and early baseball from these three great historians. With us tonight, we have Bill Ballou, a gold card member of the Baseball Writers Association of America. You see his stories regularly in the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. Brian Goslow, the historian of the Worcesters, but also the managing editor of Artscope, and you've certainly seen his stories through the years in Worcester Magazine and other local publications. And Dr. Janette Greenwood of Clark University, a fan of early baseball in Worcester and lots of other places, and also well known to us for her work on the Bullard collection with the Art Museum and her book, The First Fruits of Freedom, a very important addition to Worcester's historical landscape. So that brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to this evening's host and ask Bill Ballou to throw out the first pitch.
All right, thanks, Bill. And my initial quick question would be to Janette is back in the 1850s when they played those 100-inning and long games, do you think they would have rather zoomed? Do you think that would have worked out better in the 1850s, a nice Zoom game or replay?
I think it would have been even more unbearable than Zoom is for us in the present day and age. It's a frightening prospect, actually, to think about 100 tally game, as they called them then, on a Zoom hookup over several days.
They had, the game that the long games that lasted days. The type of baseball played was a little bit different than the type of baseball that we know now. In what ways?
Yeah, well, maybe I should switch over to my PowerPoint, and so I can illustrate that a little bit. Yeah. I'll switch up here. I can go back to these other topics, but yeah, just to give you an example here, the game as it really emerges, at least in New England before the Civil War, was known as town ball in some cases, or just the Massachusetts game. And at this time, there are two competing games, the New York game and the Massachusetts game. And as you can see here, the Massachusetts game looks a bit unusual. If you look at the diagram of the ball field, you see the shape of the infield is really more or less a square. There were no foul lines. First base is directly to the right. The player does not, rounding the bases, doesn't really return to home, but goes to fourth base, or what we would call home base. And this was a game very much of finesse rather than power. The ball was thrown overhand, but it's a very soft and squishy ball with a very small circumference. And an accomplished batter was somebody who could spin the ball and make it do all kinds of crazy bounces and that sort of thing. There's no foul territory in this game. And so players could, come up with all kinds of ways to try to outfox the fielders in this game. A batter was even allowed to turn 180 degrees at home plate in order to hit behind the catcher. So it's a very interesting game. You didn't really need to even run the bases in order after you ran to first base, but you did have to go back. If you went from first to third, then you had to go back and go, to second to avoid an out. There were 3 misses, 3 strikes basically, and you were out. But this is also a game very different in the sense that it's 1 out and the entire side is out. No 3 outs per inning. So it's 1 out per half inning. So this means the game actually moves pretty quickly. I've had students play this game in my baseball course at Clark. We played against a local vintage team from Holliston, and it's really a fun game. I mean, you're just moving back and forth all the time. But as Bill's already suggested, it takes 100 tallies or runs in order to win the game. So the game could actually last for a couple days, and often did, to get to that 100 tally score. And the other thing, I'll just focus on a couple more things that made this game different to answer your question. The ball was also, the only way you could make an out was if the ball needed to be caught on the fly, or you could, what was called soak or plug the runner between bases. So you just basically throw the ball really hard at a runner, just like you would in kickball, only with a small little squishy ball, in order to make an out. So there are no tags for outs or anything like that. So very different kind of game, but as I said, one that I've played several times with my class, but also a really fun game. We never made it to 100 tallies, though, I should say.
Yeah. It's interesting that, the Massachusetts game was eventually surpassed by the New York game as the popular one. I'm wondering if that's because it was easier or not as much fun to play, or because the New York game was better for spectators. Any guesses on that?
Yeah, I mean, baseball historians who have looked at this argue that, the New York game, which is really the game that's would be much more familiar to us, with 3 outs per inning, 9 innings, that sort of thing. The New York game was better for spectators because it did have foul territory, which the Massachusetts game didn't. It also was a game that fit much more with an urbanizing society. There were a couple games played in Worcester that were kind of famous, particularly I think in 1859 they were. And I think I have some example. Oh yeah, you can see how these guys played barehanded, of course. They didn't wear gloves because it was not considered very manly to do so. But you can see what sort of a box score, so a very crude one, looked like. Only showing the runs, the tallies of each team. This was a game played between a team, the Medway team versus Upton. They were considered to be 2 of the top teams in New England, and probably in the country, really, before the Civil War. And you can see the names here and how many tallies each one of them scored. But there was a big game in Worcester at the Agricultural Fairgrounds in 1859. Where there was a purse that was raised by the Mechanics Association in Worcester that also had its own baseball team to bring these 2 teams back together in 1859 to play. And this game went on for 2 days, of course, until they finished it. And it started actually on a Tuesday. So Tuesday morning, it starts at 11 o'clock. There were about 4,000 or 5,000 people there at the agricultural grounds, which I'm sure Brian will talk about. They had a break for dinner. The score in the first day was Upton 67, Medway 33. It resumes like 3 days later on a Friday, where it starts again after dinner break, and it finally ends with Upton being the victorious team over Medway. So this was not the kind of game that was going to work in industrializing America. It was a game that really came out of rural America. It becomes very popular, of course, in cities, and cities help develop and grow the game, especially with spectators. But partly, I think that the New York game surpasses the Massachusetts game because, again, it was just a much more contained in terms of time. There probably was a point where your employer wasn't going to let you take 2 days off to go watch a baseball game and see how it all turned out. The New York game also expands more quickly across the country because there are many more people traveling to New York as a center of commerce and business, and those folks take the New York game back with them to other parts of the country. So even like by the time of the Civil War, it seems like the New York game is really beginning to dominate. And we have this image here of a game of Union prisoners in Salisbury, North Carolina, playing baseball. And you can see they're not playing the Massachusetts game. They're playing on a diamond and playing the New York game. And of course you have foul territory and you have people watching. So there are a lot of different reasons, kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but there are lots of different reasons why this game will dominate.
It strikes me that this picture of the prisoners of war may be a bit idealized.
I think so.
I'm not so sure it was such a pleasant experience.
No, they look awfly healthy for being in a Confederate prison.
And the lineup cards you had, I noticed one of the players, and I forget which team it was on, was, C.J. Fisk. I wonder if he's a progenitor of Carlton Fisk. I mean, the names are exactly the same almost.
Somebody asked me that. Yeah, I gave a talk at Clark in April, and someone noticed the Fisk right away. So who knows? One thing that's interesting that someone else noticed which I didn't notice when I first, when I gave a talk at Clark, was G.H. Stoddard. Mm-hmm. And he actually plays an interesting role in terms of historians trying to figure out more about the origins of baseball. And I go back here to John Thorne's book, Baseball in the Garden of Eden, which is an excellent book if you're interested in the early game. And John Thorne for a while was like the official historian of Major League Baseball, which would be like the coolest job ever. And he's written a lot about the early game. And he argues, of course, the whole Cooperstown myth, the Cooperstown story is a myth, and it was created out of whole cloth by something called the Mills Commission in 1905, and that's a whole other story we can talk about later if you want to. But John Thorne says that Upton, Massachusetts, right here in Worcester County, has the best claim, he believes, to be a place where we can really identify, recognize the modern game of baseball for the first time. And he bases that on the fact that George Stoddard, I assume is that same G.F. Stoddard because he played for the Upton team, was interviewed by the Mills Commission in 1905. He would have been a pretty old man at that time. And he said, even though the commission didn't pay any attention to this and decided to make Abner Doubleday the inventor of baseball, he said that Stoddard told the commission that he had played in the 1850s. Again, we see him in the lineup. And he said the game was played in Upton by his grandfather and great-grandfather. And he said that the game was played in Upton at least since the time that Upton became a village in 1735. So that claim is more than 50 years before another claim that some of you probably know about from Pittsfield, where they noticed in the town ordinances and things mention of baseball not being permitted near the church building because they didn't want baseballs, cracking windows and things like that. So this is sort of an interesting claim, I think, for Upton and for Worcester as a kind of the cradle of baseball as we know it. So it's maybe the Hall of Fame should be in Upton and not in Cooperstown.
Well, I live in Whitensville, which is next to Upton. And this is wonderful news to me. And Upton hasn't changed that much since 1735. So you could probably go back and see some of the spots. I mean, there was plenty of open area in Upton to play back then. This is the first I've heard of this. This is great. And John Thorne is like the expert on baseball history. So this is a pretty credible claim.
Yeah, I think so too. And I was thrilled. I had assigned part of this book in my class. And so I had read it, the summer before, and I was like, oh my gosh, Upton, Mass. I mean, I just thought it was amazing because he goes into all the details about the various claims, and we can't really think about baseball as being an invented sport. It's something certainly developed over time from all kinds of bat and ball games, which go back, centuries. But he thinks this is the most credible claim. So I think that's something, I think Worcester should do something with that. Worcester County should do something with that claim.
I vote for the Baseball Hall of Fame, and I'm a relatively frequent visitor to Cooperstown, which has a great research facility. And I'm friendly with a couple of the big shots. So I'm gonna put this out there and move the Baseball Hall of Fame to Upton.
There you go. Good. Start the movement.
If the Pawtucket Red Sox can move to Worcester, the Hall of Fame can move to Upton. I think that those are very similar activities.
That's right.
This is it's interesting. You talked to Brian, who's the expert on the Worcesters, and how different by the time the Worcester was there in 1880. How everything had evolved to a point where, there was a major league, there were minor leagues, people could make a living playing baseball. They can, it wasn't modest a living. If you look, baseball players have always been paid more than the average person. They just couldn't work at the same mill for 50 years. Their baseball careers were short. But, J. Lee Richmond made $2,400 a year in the early 1880s. That was pretty good pay. And and so I mean, it's always been that way. And the Worcesters were, for that one year, Brian, 1880, a very successful, I guess, a moderately successful franchise in the National League.
When Worcester joined the National League. Am I coming through, everyone?
I can hear you. But you're beeping.
Okay. When Worcester joined the National League in 1880, I think a lot of the talk was the excitement that J. Lee Richmond would be pitching in the league, because the season before, while still attending Providence, Brown University in Providence, he had pitched a no-hitter against the defending champion Chicago team. So there was the thought that, Worcester was, put together a really good team that was going to make a run for the money. And for a while, they did, and stayed near the top of the standings for a good part of the start. So the Worcesters, and someone actually asked me, did they ever actually call them the Worcesters? And now it's made me go back to some of my old Telegram clippings, which is just pretty much, they would start articles by saying the Worcesters did this, or the Worcesters, did that. So they played at the Worcester County Agricultural Fairgrounds, which in terms of Worcester today was, right there would be good. The Worcester County Agricultural Fairgrounds, what we're seeing right here is the entrance on what was then Agricultural Street, and which is now Russell Street, right across from Elm Park. And it was mainly used for agricultural events to go with the name. And strangely, around it, it had a driving park that would have horse races. And then inside the track, they built up a baseball park. And it made for quite a strange situation that you certainly couldn't think of today. The people, and I was kind of thinking the situation, my wife Louise asked me, how does this compare, say, to today, to what we're seeing with the Red Sox? And everyone's talking about, the challenges of finding parking. Well, when you went to the fairgrounds, there was a track outside, next to the photo. It would be outside the driving track. People who were well-to-do would take their horses and their carriages, and a big picnic, and watch the ball games. There was stands for approximately 4,000 people that people would watch when they weren't falling down the stairs in drunken fights or screaming and yelling at each other. And the players were playing on a field where quite frequently in the morning, there would be auctions of, some of the animals, that were kept on the fairgrounds, because the Seaver Street side of the fairground had a bunch of barns and sheds where, animals would be out there. Can only imagine during the game, there was, a lot of mooing and haying and things going on, but they would have oxen pulls out in the outfield. And back in 1880, 81, you didn't have the same kind of equipment that we had today. So there's one incident where the Providence newspaper talked about, there was a play where a ball was hit into right field, and the Providence outfielder disappeared into one of these holes from the previous oxen pull, and he didn't come out for a few innings, and kind of added to the way people looked, at Worcester, and found things, like that. And next, the photo. So here is a picture, probably taken from a house on Fruit Street. Back 30 years ago, when I did a lot of my research, I kind of tracked down which house this photo would have been taken for. But if you look at it, the white kind of in the middle of the photo, that's the fence that surrounded the fairgrounds. And there's the house that's on the left inside the fence was the agricultural hall. And if you look to the right in front of the stands, that was where people would look down to cover the games, at the time. And then everything out there was the outfield for the games. So the biggest, thing that kind of goes with the history of the Worcesters took place 141 years ago this Saturday on June 12th, 1880, when J. Lee Richmond pitched the first perfect game in history. Next. Okay, just as reference for people. So this is where the fairgrounds was dropped into today's map. So Russell Street would be Elm Park. At the bottom of it is Seaver Street. To the right is Highland Street. And then you have William Street and then Cedar Street to the left at the end of the property. Next. This is, the first kind, scene of, them called the Worcesters. A lot of city teams were called by their name. They just added an S to it. Just only, as Bill said, Worcester never went beyond just being the Worcesters. It seemed to work out well.
This was not, Brian, this was not unusual. Even the teams, the minor league teams in 1900s, they were the Fall Rivers, the Lowells. I mean, this idea of nicknames sort of evolved over time accidentally. And so, Worcesters, people assume that everyone always had to have a nickname, but that wasn't the case. And you're right, Worcester was just a plain old Worcesters.
And, even though this was a National League team, it's very, very hard to find, any artifacts tied to the team. Somewhere in the last decade, this showed up on the Antiquarian Society website. And I was, really excited because through the last 30 or 40 years, I tried to find anything, tied to the team. So
Yeah.
This one was a great artifact. And next, I think this is probably the greatest artifact tied to Worcester. It's E. Pollard's Ups and Downs of the Worcester Baseball League Season 1880. It was a little book that was published in Worcester, and it may be, I was told by the head of the Hall of Fame Library when I did my research there in 1988, that this may be the rarest artifact tied to Major League Baseball history. A second one, hasn't turned up anywhere, that I've heard, since at the time when I went, he kind of put it in my hands, and it was kind of the holy grail of, Major League Baseball to look at it. And, at the time, we were, also starting to talk about having an old time game with Worcester and Troy. And I tried to see if there was a way we could get photographs or copies of it. And back then, there still wasn't a way to really safely open the book and make a photocopy of it. And John Thorne, I think, actually helped, get it out to the world in 2015 or so. But this
Who was E. Pollard? Do you know, Brian?
he was a local printer.
Huh?
He did other, printings, in Worcester, and it was just, something that I want to say it's somewhere I found there was some tie to it, be given out through the paper at the end of the year.
Yeah.
I have to go back for it. But, what makes this one, unique is this is the one that was the drawing that was created for the perfect game. And if you look at it, now a perfect game is still, a big thing. There hasn't been that many of them since there was professional baseball. And, as you notice, there's not a single mention of, a perfect game or a no-hitter, the terminology that's, come along with us since that time.
Yeah, they're the whitewashers. And, but yeah, well, since no one had ever seen a perfect game, they didn't quite know how to describe it. And you didn't know how many it would be. There was another one 5 days later. That's the bizarre thing, is that 5 days after Richmond pitched his, John Montgomery Ward pitched another one. Baseball is crazy that way. Things happen in bunches.
Next in the photos. Okay, so this here is the only known that I know of composite photo of the Worcesters taken together through John Richmond Husband, who is the great grandson of J. Lee Richmond, who's done a fabulous job, did a fabulous job of documenting the history of his great grandfather and the no-hitter. And actually in my own, research, I kind of, because he had done such a great job, always, defer to people to track down some of his research, which I believe you can find, online and be available, through the Hall of Fame. But it's pretty fabulous to see them like this. There's also a composite photo, which I know, I'm not sure if it's, right now, if it's, at Polar Park, the great collector, from Leicester, kind of tracked it down. I found a.
It is at Polar Park, yes.
Okay, because it was something that in research, I found an article from the 1930s that talked about Worcester's days as a National League team. And it was, at that time, it was hiding somewhere, in a building, on Main Street. And then I think, Wayne Tedesca, I think he discovered it, in a bar room, down on Lincoln Street, and thankfully, saved and preserved it, that we have as a piece of our Worcester history. Next on the photos. So then it comes to the nicknames. When you find history books of Worcester, and a lot of them, do a rundown of all the major league teams, Worcester is frequently called the Ruby Legs and the Brown Stockings. Rarely do they call them the Worcesters. And when I did my research in 1988, and after I got to hold the cartoon book, the head of the library, the director, said to me, "But I know what you're here for." And I had gone through all the telegrams and all the gazettes and all the Worcester spies, looking to confirm either the Brown Stockings or the Ruby Legs nickname. And he handed me a scrapbook that a Boston fan had kept throughout the 1880s. And he said, "What you're looking for is here." He didn't point it out to me. He let me, go through it and do the research, and it was up to me. And, what I found cut out was here is from the Boston Herald. And it said, "Boston's ruby-legged veterans polish off Worcester's jewels." And it gave me the impression that somewhere along the line, someone did some research and saw this. And, like many of us do when we go to libraries, we do research, we're scribbling all the notes down and we go back to them later. And my guess is that's how the Ruby Leg nickname, came to be. As far as the Brown Stockings, each team had their own color that they wore in their uniforms and their hats and their socks and trim of the uniform. And Worcester did wear the Brown Stockings. I never did find it capitalized, as a team name in any time I looked through the papers. What I did find is at the Worcester Public Library, there's I believe it was 1977 Holy Cross research paper by Michael Moore, in which he did call them the Brown Stockings. And a few years back, I met him, at a gathering here in the city, and I asked him, where did he get the Brown Stockings? And he said, well, maybe I took, a few liberties, to move my, story along. And, it's, not nothing that I think, doesn't, happen along the years, but when you're trying to come up with a historical record, the real goal is to find out for sure, was it ever actually the Brown Stockings? And no to the Brown Stockings, none to the Ruby Legs, as far as I've been able to find in any searching.
You don't think they'll possibly name the Worcester Jewels, do you?
I never saw that used any other time.
Neither have I, but I just wonder, and I suppose that jewels are some sort of play on rubies, in the upper headline, but that's the only reference I've ever seen to them, that they weren't the Worcesters. So, but yeah, I never saw them refer to the jewels. It's just probably just us, just like Michael Moore, thinking that since we have nicknames now, they must have had nicknames in the 1880s, and the world has changed quite a bit since then.
Next picture. So one of the crazy things of the fairgrounds, and, I was thinking to send in this David Meller at Fenway Park, who's more and more events keep thrown there and concerts and, and he still has to get the park ready. So at the end of the 1880 season, when the Worcesters were out on their last road trip for the year, the Worcester County Agricultural Fairgrounds was used for what it was created for, which was the annual fair. And this is, exactly what it looked for. And I'm thankful for it because that, had a diagram, that I did in the, that I used to kind of figure out where everything was placed with the fairgrounds and figuring out how the ballpark was set up. And, this is one of the great things with the photos, with this photo, is you can see the way the carriages were lined up, along the outside of the driving park for watching baseball games. I guess maybe these are the original skyboxes, there. And then you can see the fence, that was surrounding the back of the field. Then, they took the tents down and moved everything. You can only imagine what kind of condition the field was in when the Worcesters came back for the last games of the season. And next. So tied to the perfect game back in 1992 with Bill and Richard Phelps and people at Becker and a group of other Worcester people came up with the idea of a National League nostalgia series, kind of based. Stephen Wolfe, who was a writer for Sports Illustrated, had found something that said that when Worcester and Troy lost their National League teams at the end of the 1882 season, the agreement was that if either of us could come up with an adequate competitive team to play, we would get to have exhibition games against major league teams. And so he said, well, he kind of just put it out for fun by saying the National League owes us something, but what it kind of did in Worcester and Troy was get the idea of, having a home and home series to kind of recreate the time. And I'm not sure, and Bill maybe can fill in how the idea came to put together, to get a monument to go on the site of where the fairgrounds was. But what, did end up, happening, we had, a bunch of meetings and we worked on, what could go on, a monument, kind of tracked and working for this, I tracked down the letters that we sent to Rex Monuments. I know sending the letter to John Richmond Husband, making sure that he was fine with, how his great-grandfather would be, measured in history on this monument. And then on June 19th and 20th, 1992, John Richmond Husband, who you see here on the left, came to Worcester. And he's pictured right here on pretty much where Pitcher's Mound, or what, the pitcher's area would have been when J. Lee Richmond pitched his perfect game. If you find the monument on Becker College, you can look and see this driveway there. When we were there, we talked to the owner of the house, and he said there had been a plaque on the house saying that that's where Pitcher's Mound had been, and that it had been a small fire which had, melted it. So, there was nothing other, that we can really go by just, someone having said, this was the property where Pitcher's Mound was. And then prior to the recreation game at Holy Cross, here is John Richmond Husband at the dedication and the unveiling, of the monument. Yeah, you can see, at Becker. And I believe that's the last, photo that I got put together. And pretty much, after that, the 1881 and 82 seasons weren't really that memorable. 1881 started out good. I believe 8 wins in a row, and they were in first place. Within 2 months, Richmond's arm started to go dead. He said, he wanted to go back to Providence and carry on what was going to be his career as a dentist. He was gone for a little bit, then he was brought back. The next year, the team was put together for, I think, $10,000, but really didn't do that well. The move started to be said that the National League themselves wanted teams in New York and Philadelphia. And towards the end of the season, there was the lowest game in history in attendance for Worcester, which was 6, which stood until April 29th, 2015, when Baltimore and the White Sox had the 0 attendance in Camden Yards when they played the game after the riots there. I always felt that I cannot believe that no one was in attendance at the game that took our place in history away. But I tried emailing the writers, the beat writers for the White Sox, the beat writers for Baltimore, because I really, really find it hard to believe that people who maybe had been season ticket holders throughout the time Camden Yards existed, or, there had to have been some of the advertisers, who still wanted to be in the ballpark, but I've never been find anyone who's willing to admit there were, 7 or 8 people there to keep us, with the record. So the one other, fallacy that sometimes goes, that, goes with the Worcesters is that the Worcesters became the Philadelphia Phillies, because that would seem to be the natural thing to go. And I think that happened because 5 or 6 players from the Worcesters went on to play for the Philadelphia Athletics of, not the National League, but another league. But if you went and did research and figured where did Worcester go, 5 of them did play in Philadelphia, but they did not play, for the Phillies.
Yeah, they're not the descendant. They just took the franchise away. Philadelphia bought in completely separately, and there was no transfer of any sort of assets whatsoever to Philadelphia. So yeah, there is no connection. And you're right.
The only connection, I could possibly find was I went down to the Philadelphia Library to find out if maybe, I could find out more, was that the Troy team actually went to Philadelphia and played exhibition games at the end of the 1882 season before they disbanded. But that's Troy. I pretty much,
that's Troy.
I left it at that.
Now, an interesting correspondence is that the Troy team went to New York and eventually were renamed the New York Giants, which is a legendary name, and now they're the San Francisco Giants. But the nickname Giants was given to New York by a guy that played for Worcester, Jim Mutry, who had played shortstop for Worcester in, I think, the 1879 minor league team. And when he went to New York as the manager, they won some big games. These boys are Giants, and that nickname stuck. So there's a connection with the New York Giants in terms of the nickname, but there's no connection between Worcester and let's say the Philadelphia Phillies. It would be nice if there were, but the Worcesters are dead. They're gone, and there's no resurrecting them. And so the other thing that's interesting is J. Lee Richmond being a dentist, and things come full circle because the president of the Worcester Red Sox, Charles Steinberg, is Dr. Charles Steinberg, and he's a dentist. So it's something about Worcester and dentistry and professional baseball seems to go together.
Well, maybe what might work out. For, you covering them is, was that I believe Freeman Brown started covering the Worcesters for the Worcester Spy, and by the time they were ending up in 1882, he was the manager.
Well, yes, he was, and I've mentioned it a couple times, but if you look at Freeman Brown's record, he was one of the least successful managers in baseball history. So I'm not sure I want to hitch my wagon to Freeman Brown. The thing is that about Worcester is that as good as they were in 1880, and they were a competitive team in 1880, they decided to save money by letting Frank Bancroft go to Detroit, who put together the 70 teams. I mean, the Spags mentality existed in Worcester back as far as 1880, so it's nothing new. And the whole franchise went right downhill after Frank Bancroft left because Freeman Brown apparently was a good reporter, but he knew nothing about actually running a baseball team. He was, in essence, what we call the general manager today. He was the Chaim Bloom of Worcester, even if he wasn't the field manager in 1881. And eventually he did take over, but yeah, he just didn't know how to run a baseball team, and the team suffered for it.
I think one of the things I'd just like to point out on one of the slides that you showed, Brian, was the fact that there were special rates for women. They could get like a package of tickets that were lower priced. And that's something, you know, women play an important part in as fans in baseball, even going back to this pre-Civil War period where baseball, you know, in some ways, some people questioned, you know, these grown men basically playing this children's game, which it had been for many, many years. The earlier versions of like, you know, Town Ball and Cat, the old Cat and things like that. And the women are always, the ladies are always encouraged to attend these games. And they got special rates even before the Civil War. And the newspapers at the time in Worcester also always commented about, you know, whether there were ladies present or not. So women give this sport a kind of respectability very early on that it needs. And it also, and because there was always gambling going on, because there's always drinking going on, the feeling was that if there were women present, it might not be quite as crazy. But it was interesting to see that slide, Brian, with a special package deal for tickets for women.
How much research has been done, Janette, on when the first time anyone ever charged admission to see a baseball game? You know, like the Cincinnati Red Stockings were the first professional team. I think people paid to see games well before that. I'm not sure. Has it been traced as far back as it can in terms of paid admissions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had to go back and check some of those old clippings that that a lot of my students gathered from, you know, the 1850s in Worcester. But I think there were admissions charges. I mean, they were, you know, very minimal, but I'm pretty sure I'd have to double check my notes, but I think they were charging some admissions to, especially to these special games like between Upton and Medford.
Yeah, I was wondering, what was the prize? A $500 prize for the winning team?
$500 prize in Mechanics Association. It's a lot of money. Yeah, it was a lot of money at that time.
Yeah, maybe they passed a hat or something, but you know, of course, there's always been gambling involved in baseball, and now it's becoming legalized gambling. You know, with DraftKings and all that stuff. For years, they threw you out of baseball if you gambled, and now they're encouraging you to gamble. Everything comes full circle that way. But you know, you read about the old days, and you know, gamblers would gamble on, you know, where the ball would land on the next pitch and stuff like that. Right. So, you know, gambling was really a major fuel for baseball for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, it lends itself, as you're suggesting, you can bet on almost anything. I mean, there's so many different ways you can bet on a baseball game, and that's one of the things. Even with this Upton Medway rivalry that was so big before the Civil War, with these two really powerful teams in this area, there were complaints about gambling at that Mechanics Association sponsored game in October. Lots of talk about, well, you know, there were gamblers involved and maybe, you know, the game was thrown. So again, that's a really old, as you're suggesting, a really old story in baseball.
Yeah,
I found something, you know, for Janette about, you know, female fans at the games. And this was along with reports of the gamblers fighting. One lady wrote the Gazette complaining of dirty conditions at the ballpark, stating, if there was less tobacco than ant shells and dirt of all kinds, and a little more neatness in the care of the grandstands, I think more ladies would attend the games. But now we must risk ruining a dress or a cloak if we go.
That's great.
That explains.
Is that written to the Spy or written to the local paper?
Wrote to the Gazette.
Interesting. That's great. That's a wonderful quote.
Yeah, you know, one of Worcester's issues through the years with professional baseball is it never had a good facility. Although for a long time, you know, the driving park was a fairgrounds, and they happened to play baseball there. Then when they moved to the Oval on Coburn Avenue, that was a track and field facility that essentially just used baseball once in a while. The field conditions were terrible. It wasn't until 1906 when Jesse Burkett built Boulevard Park across from East Park on Shrewsbury Street. They actually had a baseball-only facility. And that ushered in, you know, like 20 years of very good professional baseball in Worcester. Now we have Polo Park, which is state of the art. But you know, the quality of the playing fields in Worcester was an issue for a long, long time back in the early days. And you know, I can't imagine I mean, you think the driving park, you wonder about the outfielders, you know, what they had to trudge through to catch balls. And you know, Brian mentioned the disappearing act for the outfielder of the old driving park.
Right.
But things come full circle. I remember covering a Red Sox game in 1991. Remember Bill Buckner, the 1986 World Series guy? Well, Buckner played his last year with the Red Sox, and he could barely move. And the last home run he ever hit in the major leagues, he hit a ball to the right field corner of Fenway Park, and the right fielder, Claudell Washington, went back against the fence to try to catch it and fell into the first row of seats, and he couldn't get out of the seats. So Buckner got an inside the park home run because Claudell Washington couldn't get out of the front row of seats. So that's almost the same thing as happened at the driving park, 100 and something years before that.
If I could interrupt, there's a question from one of our viewers asking, well, there were two. One, you addressed what exactly happened to the Worcester team. Where did it go? Who are they connected to? The other one is a concern about the monument at Becker, the Becker campus. I wonder, and the question is, with Becker dissolving, do we know that that monument is secure, or has anyone looked into the future of its future as an important place in Worcester?
I always, Brian, the monument is there because Brian found out where the pitcher's mound was after a lot of research. That's one of the reasons why it was, no one really knew where the field was, and Brian did the research. So I've always considered the monument to be Brian's baby. So he may know more about it than I do.
I mean, I haven't asked anyone yet that. I mean, my belief is, last I heard, the plan was, that Clark was going to take on, some of the, the video game, programming and be based, on the Worcester, the Becker was, campus. Maybe you should do a little more, follow up to do that, because as long as those buildings were being used, I couldn't see any reason that the monument would go anywhere. As far as for where the various Worcester players went, they were all dispersed, throughout various, leagues, and went to other places. And, just one, I guess one other mention, of Worcester's place, in lasting history is John Clarkson played for the 1882 Worcester team, and he's now in the Hall of Fame. He only played 3 games for Worcester, and it was kind of at a period where they were almost adding any warm body they could find to fill in holes in the lineup. And, didn't have much to write home about in his 3 games here, but again, went on to be one of the great players in the history of the sport.
We don't have other questions in the chat box, but I wonder if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask this panel of our team a question as we get close to 8 o'clock here. Anybody from the floor? No? Well, then if there are no more questions, I would.
Bill?
Yes.
Al Cooper, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thanks. How are you, Alan?
I'm doing wonderful.
Come on.
I have a question. The pictures are absolutely fabulous, and the history that those pictures encounter is wonderful. Are any of those pictures available to buy?
Certainly the ones at the Worcester Historical Museum are.
The ones that were shown today in the slide presentation.
We'll leave it to Janette and Brian to speak to their sources and what they think about that question.
Let me just
most of what I showed on my PowerPoint, all of that is available. I think. Well, I did take a couple. I guess I did have a couple slides of photos that I took of some of the photocopies of old Worcester newspapers. I mean, if you're interested in those, I'd be happy to pass those along. But the other images, I think, were all available online.
And we are recording this program, so if you want to ask that question, or if you want to review the program and send us an email inquiry about specific images, we'll try to get back to Janette or Brian, or look in our collection and answer that question for you more specifically. We're always happy to help with those sorts of questions, and there are other pictures of the agricultural grounds in our collection here at the museum, certainly, and probably others at the Antiquarian Society.
Maybe you could do a little piece, a little folder or a poster, whatever, that you could use as a fundraiser for the Historical Museum.
I think you should, Alan, you should encourage our panel of historians here to write that little, story of early baseball and the
It's just great. So many people
Worcesters, and
don't
we
know.
make
So
it
many people
available to
don't
the
know.
world. Well, now that you say that, and you ask that question, I would encourage you to watch Worcester at Bat, as it says here on the screen, the 27-minute virtual exhibit with tonight's moderator and our star pitcher, Bill Ballou, that's on our YouTube channel here for worcesterhistory.org. It's a great piece, and it tells you a lot of stories of baseball. And of course, as we've heard tonight, there's lots more to add to it. And we'll be having another program on July 14th at 7 p.m. with Janette and Bill Ballou again, and they'll be joined by Chuck Arning. We'll be talking about some of the local teams, some of the corporate teams, a little bit more about the Miles Standish League, some of the lesser known and certainly more interesting teams that we might want to know more about. Tonight's program is brought to you with lots of significant support from NEH, the Worcester Together Fund, the Daniels Foundation, the Mass Cultural Council. And we are certainly at the Worcester Historical Museum grateful to them, but we're even more grateful to all of you for joining this evening, and to Bill Ballou, Brian Goslow, and Janette Greenwood, our members of the Baseball Hall of Fame in Worcester.
Can I interrupt Bill for a second?
Sure.
Jeanette, get hold of me. I'm going to begin the campaign to move the Hall of Fame to Upton. So,
Okay.
I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. So after this done, we got to connect, because I want to get that ball rolling.
Okay, and if you've got contact with John Thorne, I mean, he would be, maybe someone who would help us out.
Yes, but anyway, I'm going to be in touch with you. So let's get to work on that. Okay.
Well, Worcester loves the challenge. It got a baseball team to move from Pawtucket. I'm sure you can move that museum. In the meanwhile, join us again in July for more baseball history. You could go to the Worcester Art Museum and see the iconic jersey exhibit. You can watch Casey at the Bat here on our website. But in the meanwhile, go to Polar Park. Go to Fitton Field, watch the Bravehearts. Go to the Art Museum, watch Casey at the Bat, celebrate Worcester and its baseball history. And we thank you very much for joining us this evening. And again, a round of applause and cheers and hot dogs and mustard for our three baseball historians. This program will be available on our museum's YouTube channel, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Celebrate Worcester.
Good.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you
night.
all.
Great job, guys.